Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Europe set out to strategically defeat Russia and reassert itself as a moral superpower. Instead, it has managed to corner itself into paying more for energy, losing industrial capacity, and watching real negotiations happen without it in the room. When Eurozone inflation spiked to around 10% after 2022, that wasn't an abstract macro story. That was the bill for a fantasy of geopolitical leadership that Europe never actually possessed. And this is where the theory meets a brick wall. The convenient lie was simple. Europe would lead the democratic front line, Russia would be crushed economically, the US would provide money and weapons on tap, and Kyiv would emerge as the heroic outpost of Western civilization. In that script, Brussels was supposed to be the director, Washington the sponsor, and Russia the defeated villain. In reality, Washington and Moscow are now probing formats for direct talks. Kyiv is being treated as a problematic asset, and Brussels is somewhere in the corridor, still rehearsing its lines. Now here's the part that keeps economists awake at night. The old European model depended on two pillars: cheap external inputs and a credible story. Cheap Russian gas and oil, cheap African and post-colonial raw materials, and privileged access to global markets made the numbers work. The story about values and European standards made everyone feel good while the trade surplus rolled in. In short, the math worked as long as somebody else supplied the fuel and bought the final product. Then the fuel source was politically detonated. The same elites who built their prosperity on discounted Russian molecules and offshore extraction suddenly declared that dependence immoral and unsustainable. They didn't redesign the industrial system, they just tried to swap the fuel. That is the structural flaw you can't fix with a press release. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Europe tried to fight a geopolitical war while relying on a peacetime economic model. The physics are not cooperating. Look at the cast of characters. The US acts as usual, flexible, cynical, transactional. Today's indispensable ally can become tomorrow's expendable proxy. We have seen this with Afghan warlords, with Saddam, with Gaddafi. Useful until they aren't. That is not a moral judgment. It is how an empire manages its inventory. Moscow, for all its own pathologies, at least knows what it wants: security depth, control over key corridors, and reliable buyers for its resources. Beijing quietly watches from the balcony, counting how many points of friction appear inside the Western camp. And then there is Brussels. The public rhetoric is about unity, values, and red lines. The private reality is that the European Commission has no army, no serious intelligence capacity, and no coherent energy strategy that works without discount fuel. Here is where the story stops making sense. An unelected bureaucracy tries to play global strategist while relying on others for hard power and cheap energy. If you're watching this from Germany, Hungary, or the Baltics, you don't need theory. You've seen the transformation on your bills. The same officials who celebrated cutting Russian pipeline gas now quietly accept LNG contracts at higher and more volatile prices while pretending this is energy independence. On paper, dependence on Russia fell. In reality, dependence on expensive imports and fragile logistics increased. You see the problem here, right? So, let's take a breath. Where does this leave us so far? Europe wanted strategic victory over Russia and moral leadership over the free world. What it actually got was double-digit inflation at the peak, higher structural energy costs, and a seat in the waiting room while Washington and Moscow explore how to freeze the conflict. And this brings us to the one number that changes the entire equation. Before the crisis, roughly 40% of EU gas imports came from Russia. That share has collapsed. But the demand for energy-intensive industry, transport, and heating did not magically disappear. You can rename the supplier and rebrand the narrative, but you cannot rewire steel plants, chemical complexes, and district heating overnight. In short, the math doesn't care about our ambitions. Now here's the part no politician wants to explain on TV. The whole ideological facade of European values was built on that surplus generated by cheap inputs. Rule of law, social protections, generous welfare, climate funds, cohesion money for new member states. All of it was easier when the energy and resource base was subsidized by geography and history. Strip out the cheap resource layer, and you very quickly see which parts of the value talk were a luxury item. The US had a story: global leadership through democracy and markets, backed by aircraft carriers and the dollar system. The USSR had a story: building communism and resisting imperialism. Both models exhausted themselves, but they were coherent for a time. What does the EU offer? European values. Freedom, democracy, human rights, all good words, but they are not unique and they are not defined as a concrete project. This is the structural flaw. No clear what for. If you work in manufacturing or energy, you've seen this movie before. When margins shrink and demand becomes uncertain, the first reaction is not grand strategy. It's salary freezes, delayed investment, and relocations. That's how ideology looks at shop floor level. Your plant closes while some commissioner in Brussels gives a speech about solidarity. This is the moment the Ukraine war stops being a distant moral crusade and becomes a line item on your heating bill or your rent. Every sanction package, every embargo, every additional military fund has to be financed by someone, not by think tank fellows in Washington, by taxpayers in Vilnius, Budapest, Berlin, Madrid. Does this look like a strategy from your corner of Europe, or just managed decline dressed up as heroism? Meanwhile, the EU leadership has one remaining political asset: the promise of future victory. As long as they can say, "We have not yet lost, the decisive phase is ahead," they can avoid serious negotiations and keep control at home. The same logic holds in Kyiv. Admitting that the battlefield objectives are unreachable would immediately raise another question. Then what exactly did you sacrifice all this for? Now, here's the quiet part, said out loud. When the real negotiations start, they will not be led by the European Commission or by the loudest Baltic politicians. They will be led by Washington and Moscow, with Beijing watching and influencing where useful. Europe, which imagined itself as the main judge and architect, is being treated as a theater, not as an author. For ordinary Europeans, the result is simple and unpleasant. Higher structural costs, more fragile supply chains, more pressure on the middle class, and a political class that still talks as if Brussels is the center of the world, while decisions shift elsewhere. The EU is discovering what it means to be a peripheral region with expensive energy and no clear ideological project. That's not a good place to be in a century defined by hard competition and resource constraints. Here is where the story stops making sense for good. You cannot build a long-term regional order on slogans, NGO vocabulary, and the assumption that cheap resources will always flow from somewhere. Systems run on physics and incentives, not on speeches. If Europe wants to stop being a spectator in its own crisis, it will need to rebuild both its material base and its story from something more solid than, "We are not Russia." Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and try to remember, slogans don't power grids. Systems do.